Welcome to this part of our winter lecture series in the history of modern state of Israel and Jewish people. This year, the name of the series is A Roller Coaster, the State of Israel and the Jewish People in the Mid-80s. Tonight is the third lecture, entitled The Last Years of the Old Economic Order, Israel's Zany Economy in the Mid-80s. Start, as I always do, by thanking our series sponsor, the Lehman family. It's the Lehman Lecture Series. Always every year come through sponsoring the series. Our specific sponsor tonight, as you can see, is Steve Kaplon in honor of his parents. Steve and I are really victims of the corona. Steve helps in, I just want you to know, Steve Kaplon is one of my team. He helps me in a lot of ways to put these things together, especially with the flyers and posters and 100 other ways. And usually it's Tuesday night, Wednesday night we would be learning together, but the corona has killed everything. I'm hoping very shortly that this will be past us as you were, and then Steve and I will be able to finally finish Mikvos and make that scene we were planning on. So thank you very much for sponsoring tonight. As I said, this will be available hopefully on my YouTube channel on Saturday night at 9 o'clock. After this week, when the clock changes, then we're going to try to make it, then the lectures will become available on the YouTube channel on Saturday nights at 8 o'clock. Okay? So this coming week, look there at 9 o'clock, and in subsequent weeks at 8 o'clock, unless we discover a miracle cure, and then we'll be back in Shomrei, and then I'll be letting you know about that as soon as possible. That's what I would prefer, and I hope that's what you prefer, unless you're becoming spoiled and getting comfortable lying in that bed with the popcorn that you should not be eating on Motzei Shabbos while I put you to sleep. Now, I do want to thank my technical team, without which none of this will happen. My son over here, Yudalev, is the chief operating officer, as you can understand, putting everything together. It's an understatement. Howard Elbaum is still putting together the PowerPoints. And Yossi Wetstein, if you're going to be seeing this in any quality, you can attribute that to him working his magic in the editing. I just want to make a few points. Number one, thank God we have a clean sweep this year. All the lectures have already been sponsored, so we're very grateful that this is the case enough to bug anybody. If anybody wants to help me in my endeavors, because all these things cost money, I'm doing the podcast now, as I think many of you know, and if anybody's interested in sponsoring podcasts or part of the podcast, which is something we're always looking for, you can send me an email or contact me, and I can give you the information. Always grateful. Finally, this is you're watching this hopefully on YouTube channel, and my son keeps telling me to remind everyone every time you go on that YouTube channel to be one of the subscribers. Apparently, that's good for everybody concerned. If you're the 1547th subscriber, then you get a free seat on my upcoming trip to Abu Dhabi. Okay, we'll be talking about that shortly. Now, without any further ado, I'll get right down to our business. As you see, tonight is called The Last Years of the Old Economic Order, Israel's Zany Economy in the mid-1980s. As I said last week, and as I described in detail in previous years, the Likud, in its 7 years of power, had made a mess of the Israeli economy. Following a road paved with good intentions, the Likud had taken Israel to economic hell. The basic problem, of course, was Menachem Begin knew nothing about economics, except at the most superficial level. Frankly, the same was true of Jabotinsky. The same was true of Ben-Gurion. Take a look at this first picture here. The leaders of Israel that we always think of, Golda Meir, Ben-Gurion, said they didn't know anything about economics. In fact, they never went to high school. First of all, Ben-Gurion never went to high school. Golda Meir went to high school, but she never went to college, not a real college. The others definitely didn't go to college, and they didn't take economics if they went to college. You know, creative writing and literature is good. I'm all in favor of that. History, of course, is supreme. But economics is kind of necessary if you're planning to set up a country. But they always figured somebody will take care of that. Okay? The two guys who ran the economy for 30 years, let's go to the next one. Levi Eshkol and Pinchas Sapir. They ran the economy for 30 years. They didn't know economics either. They didn't go to college. But they learned the basics along the way through a lot of trial and error, more error than trial, plus intimate familiarity with each and every business and factory was set up in Israel. So here you have a picture from the 50s. The two guys in the middle are the two guys that ran the economy. Ben-Gurion, in charge of foreign policy and that kind of stuff, that's what he's interested in. He couldn't care less. He didn't know anything about Hakalkala, the economics. He leaves that to Eshkol and Sapir. And Eshkol and Sapir were real Zionists, of course, and they built every farm and every factory. They're the ones who knew the architectural details and really did. But let's put it this way. They didn't know about balancing a budget. They didn't know about, economic outliers and things of that nature. They realized pretty doggone quick. Eshkol was the guy in charge of the economy in the first years of Israel. They realized pretty doggone quick they need trained economists. Okay? Guys with PhDs actually know what the heck they're talking about. And that's why in the next slide, you see Professor Patinkin, Tom Patinkin, a Chicago boy, who, by the way, learned in Skokie. And back in the 40s. But more importantly for our story, went to the University of Chicago and got a PhD in economics. As you know, University of Chicago, that's Milton Friedman territory, right? So he got a PhD in economics. He actually studied with a very famous socialist economist, a guy named Lang, who was a friend of Stalin. It's a strong, crazy story in post-war Poland. But anyway, Patinkin was what you would call today a real economist, and he was a Zionist passionately, and he moved to Israel in 1949, and he understood that he's filling a void, and he got a job teaching in Hebrew University. They were glad to get a guy who has an actual PhD from the University of Chicago. He introduced practical economics into Israeli academia. So Israel used to have a couple of economy specialists in the European style, which is they analyze theory. You understand? Are you in favor of Keynes? Are you in favor of Friedrich Hayek? All that kind of business. Schumpeter, etc., etc. American trained economists were like, how do you make this actually be implemented as a matter of policy? I don't want to get off too much on a tangent, but the United States won the war because after making that gigantic mess of things in Washington, Roosevelt finally put two or three, this is a true story, put two or three Jewish economists in charge of everything. It was a guy Kuznets and a couple others, Robert Nathan, and they got everything in order. It's quite interesting. And then the American economy started to actually turn out all those millions of ships and guns, and we won the war. Now, this Professor Patinkin, his students became the trained economists in the Israeli government. So you went to Hebrew U, if you did your work correctly, and he made sure that you did a year in England or in America or something like that, and you came back, you actually knew about practical economics, and then you immediately got a job with the Israeli government, the Treasury Department, the Economics Department, and so forth. The job of these trained economists was to balance the fiscal books. Eshkol and Sapir made the macroeconomic decisions, but of course they had those strange twin goals, which kind of incompatible. Let's go to the next one. Eshkol and Sapir, remember this is the Mapai era. Number one, they wanted to run a fiscally sound economy, which would grow and grow. Why not? Number two, they wanted to ensure that Mapai controlled the economy. The two don't go together. Because if you're going to point and allocate resources based on buddy system, it's good for the party, then it's not good economic decisions. Now, Eshkol and Sapir knew that their approach is kind of economically flawed. And so the Israeli economy was run in the 50s and 60s on a kind of mercantilist basis by Eshkol and Sapir, plus by the economists. Right? Sort of look like you run your household finances. They knew every penny that was in Israel. They knew how much money is available for spending, more or less. They decided how to spend that money, usually on things that are good for Mapai, they hope, hopefully for the country. The economists, the trained economists, were there to tell them, you're spending too much on this, and there won't be money at the end of the year. But Eshkol would say, but I thought we have this and this and this. Well, there's a rule in economics that tells you that money is gone. So, okay, if you say so, you say so. So it was like a funny partnership in running the economy. A key element in the old economy was enforcing a low standard of living for the Hamon Am. No foreign imports, for example. So in other words, Israel was a poor country. They produced what they produced. They put together a little bit of money. That's the money they have to play with. That kind of money will be frittered away when people buy, Japanese cars and radio sets and air conditioning. No, they won't. And nobody buys a car. And nobody buys air conditioning. We won't allow it in the country. That's all. The people who live on low standard of living. We're not going to spend a fortune on housing. We're going to do Salah Shabbati. And that's the way it's going to be. And they could get away with it because it was the Mapai era. This is basically the approach of a parent who says we have to practice frugality in the household because we don't have a high income. And so therefore nobody here can get the Hanukkah present that they would like. You understand? Nobody here is buying that car. Maybe I'll get you a 20-year-old car. You can't get the car you want. That was the old approach. And since Israel was a parliamentary dictatorship, remember there's no constitution in Israel. So there's no checks and balances. There's this one group called the Knesset of 120. If you control the Knesset, especially in those years the Supreme Court was very weak. If you control the Knesset, you can do basically whatever you want. So such policies of forced austerity were possible. Now, the question then becomes, so what did they do with the money they had to play with? The revenue available for spending, what did the governments do with that? Some of the money was used wisely, like for infrastructure. That's what every economist knows you need. You need your roads, you need your harbors, you also need your universities and places to train specialists and technology and all that sort of thing. And some of the money was used less wisely to subsidize histadrut industries, including the inefficient ones, so that the Mapai could control the economy, plus provide for employment. So basically, we just realized the country needs, the country needs a tire factory for rubber tires. Okay, the government, the histadrut, will build the factory, and they'll run it, and they'll appoint for the director Golda Meir's brother-in-law or something like that. And the idea is, we're going to put it in Nazareth, and we have an unemployment problem in Nazareth, so let's get them to employ 6,000 people. Actually, you need 600 people. Yeah, I know, but we need to keep the unemployment down, so let's employ 6,000 people, and we'll give everybody something else plus a ton. That's the old system, you understand? Now, by the way, a large part of the money that's spent, not wisely, not economically, is for agriculture. All the kibbutzim were subsidized by the government. When you see the kibbutzim producing all these fields of oranges, all the rest of it, they are, it's true, but it's not economically efficient. They can't compete with others. It's if the government gives them extra money, so then the kibbutz can stay in business. You understand? Now, every country in the world, including the United States, subsidizes its agriculture. Okay? It's never true anywhere. We all know this since the 1800s, that you can just leave the farms up to the capitalist cycle, boom and bust. Because every once in a while the farmer will make a mistake, and then they'll be out of business, and then you won't have any farms. And then when nobody's producing any food, and the country needs food, and these people know to run the farms. So the government, like in America, elsewhere, for a long time, just pays money out to these farmers or agribusiness now or things of that nature. And I say again, every country in the world does it, and Israel is one of them. Plus, I might say, the Mapai Party was determined that nobody should live well, but nobody should starve. And therefore, they were determined to keep the prices of basic foods down and low. And so the bottom line is nobody can have a TV, but a loaf of bread costs 4 cents. You know what I'm saying? Now, always at the end of the day, these policies, which were macroeconomic and they're partisan, and they're there to make sure that the country's run in a certain socialist way, and according to the idea that the government, the histadrut, should organize and own all the machinery and the workers. At the end of the day, these policies had to be vetted by the economists. Eshkol, Ben Gurion, Sapir, all the others would then go and say, listen to what we want to do, but you guys have the training, and the economists, it was their job in the Ministry of Finance and in the Ministry of Economic Affairs. These are places that you never saw in the headlines, but these are the ones where real decisions are made. Make sure we don't go broke. And that the economic and fiscal policy, I repeat, the fiscal policy, is sane and not necessarily wise. So was there inflation? Yeah, there was inflation, some. I would say approximately 9%. There was inflation, but not too much. Because the economists would say, it's always tempting for the politicians to say, let's just print a lot of money. And then the economists said, well, if you print the money, that'll hurt this and that and the other. And then Eshkol would say, okay, no, if you insist. Now, when Menachem Begin took over in 1977, the Mapai economy was not in great shapes, and it was reeling from a number of heavy blows. This is 1977. Remember, Begin took over 4 years after the Yom Kippur War. Defense spending shot through the roof as a reaction to the Yom Kippur War and the subsequent expansion, the dramatic expansion of the Israeli army, of the IDF. You see, Israel shot first in 67, and we beat them, even though they outnumbered us. But as everybody knows, in 73, they shot first and surprised us. And the Soviets gave the Egyptians and Syrians zillion tanks and planes and so forth. And the Israelis were shocked that they were fighting 2-to-1 odds, 3-to-1 odds, 4-to-1 odds, because the Israeli tanks weren't where they're supposed to be and everything wasn't there. And the Russians had everybody oversupplied. And basically, the Israelis concluded after the Yom Kippur War that we were too small. And in the words of General Elazar, in the military, at a certain point, quantity becomes quality. And so we used to think one Israeli can beat 10 Egyptians. It's not really true. You know, one Israeli tank can't beat 10 Egyptian tanks, so we better have more than one tank. And consequently, after the Yom Kippur War, as a reaction to the Yom Kippur War, Israel like doubled the army, you know, and they increased dramatically their defense spending and built up more divisions in the army and the Air Force and so forth, and that cost a fortune. And so all of a sudden, there's less money to spend on other things because it's all going for the military. The defense burden that I'm talking about will only grow and grow. Take a look at the next one. And this is despite aid from Uncle Sam. Nixon, believe it or not, is the one who started giving Israel unilateral money for the military and for the civilian, contrary to popular belief. The way America used to do before that was if there was an international program that the U.S. ran, Israel would get a piece. But Nixon, especially after the Yom Kippur War, you know, put in a couple billion to help the Israeli military, that's straight for Israel, and a couple billion for the civilian aid. And Israel couldn't have done without it. And so, even with this shot in the arm, they were reeling, because the Nixon money didn't cover all the dramatic increase in the defense spending. Second of all, and by the way, take a look at the next one. As a result, just look at this. Defense expenditures, right? Now, I'm going to be showing you a couple of charts tonight. They're not boring, so don't turn away. Don't be stupid, right? Defense expenditures used to be 9% of the GNP. So in other words, whatever Israel produced that year, the defense spending, which is a lot, was almost 10%. But by the time you finish with Begin, it was 22% of GNP. A country can't afford that, especially a poor country. If so much of your money is going for the weapons, what's going for the civilian? You understand? The direction was not a good direction. Then, in addition to that, Israel had the misfortune, as everybody did, to get hit with the oil rise. Remember, after the Yom Kippur, the Arab oil, boycotts, and the dramatic rise in the price of oil. Do you know how much the oil jumped in the 70s? 20 times. In other words, in 1972, you spent $1 for whatever of oil. By 1980, you spent $20. Now, that means Israel doesn't have oil, but Israel needs oil and gas, you know, even if they don't have a lot of cars. They need oil like any country. The price shot through the roof. And so once upon a time, they were going to be spending $1 million. Now you got to spend $20 million where you used to spend $1 million. So that really hit Israel in the kisser. So you got the defense spending shooting through the roof. You got the oil price, the energy prices going through the roof. And then, here's like a side issue. Israel used to be a junior member of the common market, which means that Europe has a common market with all those countries, the European community. And once upon a time, believe it or not, Europe was sympathetic to Israel. And Israel cut in a deal where they could be de facto part of the common market, which therefore means Israel can sell its agricultural produce to Europe. And there was a time, before now with the BDS and all that junk, where anywhere you go in Europe, in the supermarkets, grocery stores, is Israeli oranges, is Israeli tomatoes, and things like that. That was a big moneymaker for Israel. This started in the late 50s and really reached a crescendo in the late 60s and 70s. Well, guess what? In 1975, Spain and Portugal joined the common market. all of a sudden Israel has to compete for oranges and all that kind of thing with Spain and Portugal. They got good oranges too. Israel was not happy with this. They got good tomatoes also. And all of a sudden Israel can't sell as much as they used to overseas. So these are little things. They're not as dramatic or sexy as the Yom Kippur War, all the rest of it. They are so important in running a country people don't realize. At the same time, by the way, Israel is now part of the common market, which means the Europeans could sell their stuff without tariffs in Israel. And that means that Israel had to increase the imports, which is bad for mercantilism. If you're spending money on stuff coming from Europe, that's money that leaves the country, and Israel doesn't have to use it for other purposes. And finally, and worst of all, the worker productivity declined by the 70s, and it stayed down ever since. Now, you know what I mean. Worker productivity is how much each guy produce. At the end of the day, how does the country make money? They got to make stuff and sell it. They got to produce things and sell it. How much do they produce? Well, depends how good how good you are. Let's say, for example, I produce $100 million worth of goods, and let's say I can export 50 million of it. So, my productivity allows me to earn 50 million bucks. Well, suppose I can get my workers to work like the Japanese. So instead of producing 100 million a year, let's say they produce 200 million a year. And I sell half of that overseas. Well, instead of making 50 million a year, I've been making $100 million a year. You see what I'm saying? So the productivity, the things that the country produces, is what it has to sell. That's the source of its, earning foreign money. That's the source of its wealth. Now, if the workers are no good or the system's no good, instead of producing 100 million a year or 50 million, what if I told you they're producing 20 million a year? Then all you have is 10 million to sell. You see? Now, Israel started out like this, like I'm doing now. Obviously, when Salah Shabbati get off the boat, is a low worker productivity. But in the 50s and 60s, even though they had this old boy system with the Histadrut and the Mapai, all the rest of it, they worked to raise the productivity of all the workers through a lot of common sense type approaches. And the productivity of the workforce did increase slowly but surely over the 50s and 60s until the Yom Kippur War. And then after the Yom Kippur War, it stopped. And I think it went down a little bit. And this is a big drag on Israel ad hayom hazeh. People don't realize it. I want you to take a look at the next slide that we're looking over here, because we have two Israels, the regular Israel and the startup nation. Listen to this. Israel's labor, this is from International Forum. Israel's labor productivity, this is written, by the way, 2 years ago, is not just among the lowest in the developed world, which means Israeli workers produce less than British workers, than French workers, certainly German workers, American workers. Israeli workers produce less. The gap between the world's leading countries and Israel has grown steadily, more than threefold since the mid-70s, which means the Israeli workers produce, for example, 20%, and elsewhere the other guys produce 60%. It's a threefold gap. The average Israeli worker produces 42 bucks an hour. The average American, closer to 80. Right? Closer to 80. That's bad news, because that means that you're not using your workers correctly, or something's wrong with the system. Because how come the American guy in the same factory is producing goods of 80 bucks an hour and the Israeli guy's only doing 42? Israel is a tale of two countries in one. One of these, the startup nation, which is the high-tech stuff, is at the technological cutting edge and even pushing it forward. So you have these sleek companies that are making vast fortunes, and they're producing all this high-tech business and selling it around the world. But then you have the other economy, the other Israel, representing a large and growing share of the population, is receiving neither the tools nor conditions to work in a globally competitive economy. And so basically you have the big Israel and the small Israel. The big Israel, the average guy's going to work and producing junk. They have the small Israel, these high-tech guys, usually American or brainiacs, Israel Silicon Wadi as they call it, and they're making the companies that others are buying. So these guys are producing and earning Israel money, the other guys are not. So you have a situation in which a small group is trying to lead the country forward, and it's like I'm carrying 500 pounds on my back. You understand? This is reflected not only in some of the developed world's highest rates of poverty and income inequality. That's very sad, I just said. They said that among the developed countries, in other words, Israel's counted as a first world country. Israel's not counted as a third world country. Sure, compared to Ghana, Israel's doing great. But compared to England, to Germany, a place like that, Israel has more poverty and more income inequality. Meaning, there are people earning a whole lot of money and people earning little and nothing in the middle. But it is a substantial burden on the economic growth of the entire nation. A rising share of the population lacking the skills to work in a modern economy is like a national engine running on fewer and fewer of its existing cylinders, with increasing difficulty in moving the economy forward. So this is a big problem that I'm talking about in Israel that people usually don't like to think about, but I'm devoting a talk tonight about economics. That's why I'm mentioning it. So as you see in the next slide, the only exception, the next one. I'm not going to read the whole thing. Go to the next one. Next one. Yeah, there it is. As you know, the startup nation is the only one that's where you see, hope and progress. But that's not good enough. Do you understand what I'm saying? You can't say that Israel can run on a couple of very successful companies. You need this across the whole society. You need it that the average guy in an average town in Israel working in some kind of high-tech situation today in the 21st century, in which they're producing goods or services that others are willing to buy. That's what it boils down to. Now, enough of this background. As I explained in detail last year, Menachem Begin, when he was in power, made a continual stream of bad decisions on the economy. Take a look at the next slide. Look at the debt under Begin, doubled. The national debt was $12.5 billion. This is Israel, not America. 12.5, and by 84, after he finished being in office, it was double. It was $25 billion. Now, for America, that's a joke. But for Israel, back in those days, it's no joke. So, it's not a good record for the economy. I like Begin, but economically it was a disaster. Now, the country was flooded with foreign imports, which Israelis could not afford, because everybody paid with the credit card. From the point of view of Israel's savings, its money in the bank, its reserves, so from the point of view of how much money the country has, much of it was frittered away in the same way that in household income, somebody says, I decided, to buy a super fancy car and $10,000 shoes and things of that nature. The Likud government, to meet the problems, printed more money. But then the inflation, as I told you, by late 84 was at 1,000%, or almost. In addition to that, you had the indexing system, in which Israel said like this: if the price of living goes up 10%, then everybody's salary automatically goes up 10%. So what does that do? In the immediate future, for the next week, it means that you're cushioned against the rise because I have an extra 10% in wages. But it also means that the inflation is getting bigger and bigger and going to crush the country. And basically, by the time Shimon Peres came into office, Israel was facing bankruptcy. Now, I want you to think about this for a second. Wouldn't have this been a terrible scenario? The state of Israel, after 2,000 years, with so much blood and sweat and tears, and the pioneers and the Chalutzim, and the three wars, 48, 56, and then 67, and then 73, all that, blood, sweat, and tears, and sacrifice and prayers that everybody put into building a state of Israel, and then it ceased to exist because they couldn't control the bankruptcy. What a shana d'charpa there would have been. And it could easily have happened. In fact, without the USA, Israel would have gone bankrupt much earlier. Do you understand what I'm saying? It boggles the mind that all the hopes and prayers of all people embodied in the state of Israel could have possibly gone away, not because of the Arabs and not because of the Soviets, but because Yankel and Shmerel couldn't keep the books straight. It's unbelievable. Now, in the middle of all this bankruptcy, Begin and Sharon launched a Lebanon war in 82. How can you afford a Lebanon war? Meaning it boggles the mind that Menachem Begin and Ariel Sharon, and I understand and I tried to explain last year why they did it, because of the terrorism coming from Lebanon and Arafat and all the rest of it. So we explained the military logic behind it. If you're broke, how can you undertake a war which is unbelievably expensive? There's nothing in the world that approaches war in expensive,ness, okay? I mean, let's take it to the next slide. Don't we in America know it? When that Iraq war cost us a couple trillion, I repeat, a couple trillion, it wasn't a walk-in. It cost a velt of money. When you go to the movies, you see a World War II movie, So, okay, I'm all in favor of that. You see the Marines and the D-Day and Saving Private Ryan and all the rest of it. But nobody ever said, I guess, but where'd the money come from? You understand? Now, as it happened, and America was able to pull off in World War II. That doesn't mean a country can afford a war all the time. It's unbelievably expensive. Now, how could Israel do that? And they got themselves into a mess. As you know, the Lebanon War turned into a Vietnam War. Israel couldn't get out, and the IDF was all over the place in south and up to the middle of Lebanon, up to Beirut area. And it's the price every day, besides the lives that were lost, the fiscal price, the financial cost of the war was unbelievable. And how did Begin, do that? Now, Menachem Begin, who I said I like him, but I'm speaking now, emes for the economics. He was incapable of making the hard decisions that would make people suffer. So, for example, as you see in the next slide, when his finance minister, Yigal Hurwitz, said like this, look, we can't make it that a loaf of bread costs 4 cents because the government's paying an extra 25 cents per loaf. So, listen, let's make the price of bread, 29 cents, 30 cents. That way the government won't spend a penny anytime somebody buys a loaf of bread. Begin's like this, how can you make the poor people pay 30 cents? But they don't have the money. It's terrible. It'll be suffering. I was elected by the Sephardim. They're wonderful people. I can't do that to them. I get it, but you have to do it. Meanwhile, in Washington, Israel's only friend in the world, the Reagan administration, wrings its hands. What's going on in Israel? They're nuts. They're loony. They're destructing their country in front of our eyes, economically. You get it? The debt's getting out of hand. The inflation's getting out of hand. It's 1,000% inflation. Israel's unraveling in front of us, even though we've been backing them ever since 1948. It was in this environment, my friends, that Shimon Peres took office as Prime Minister of Israel around Rosh Hashanah of 1984. This was the chance of Shimon Peres, who had longed for decades to reach Prime Minister, to show his stuff, to demonstrate his abilities to lead, to show he was not merely a politician, as he was always accused of being. So basically, Peres realized correctly that this was his Churchill moment. Now, on the other hand, Peres was not the prime minister of a Mapai government, of a labor government. It was a coalition, as I explained to you last week. A coalition with the despised Likud party. And the treasury was in the hands of the Likud. Although the Likud guy who was in charge of the treasury was a deficit hawk. He was on the same page with Peres. In other words, he said like his Begin is crazy. We got to cut and this and that and the other. That's the next slide. Yitzhak Modai, who's in the Liberal Party, if you know what that is, of the Likud, which is the more capitalist side. And he was the Sarah Ozer, and he was an inflation warrior. He's like this, we got to do what we got to do. Now, there was little dispute, therefore, between Shamir and Peres over the need for budget cutting, credit restraint, and general austerity to curtail inflation and halt the hemorrhage of Israel's foreign policy reserves. Let's go to the next slide. These are the goals. You can't spend as much as you've been spending, so you got to cut the budget. So you say this, oh, we can't do without more airplanes. Okay, if you have more airplanes, you can have fewer schools. And if you have the same schools, you have the price of bread has to go up. You see what I'm saying? Like that. Number 2, credit restraint. We can't have it that, it's easy to borrow money because everybody borrows the money and then they spend it. It's got to be that I'm going to stop you from buying a foreign car by making it that if you take out a loan for the foreign car, you pay 10% interest, 20% interest. Things like this. I can't do that. Good. Don't buy the foreign car. So you have to restrain the credit. Okay? You have to drive the interest rate higher. And finally, general austerity. The country as a whole has to live more cheaply. Okay? Now, basically, Peres faced a situation like a father or a mother in a household who, maybe we've all experienced this one time or another. Not in Baltimore, of course, but in other cities. That, here comes the bill from the credit card. And then the mother, let's say, calls in the whole family and says, what the heck is going on over here? Okay? This family has to stop spending. And I see that you're all irresponsible. So I am tearing up all the credit cards. And from now on, I'm going to do all the shopping. And the kids screamed, they said, no, there's no choice. because we'll lose the house and we'll go broke. So now Shimon Peres had to face this, and frankly, as you see in the next slide, Peres now had his finest hour, in my opinion. Right? Now he had his finest hour. Shimon Peres is an impressive guy. I think that he had certain wrong shittas, and we'll talk about that later this semester, I hope. But he was a very capable person, and when his abilities were matched with the right policy, then he could do amazing things. Shimon Peres is now prime minister. He sits down and thinks. First, he has to show the world that Israel is serious about stopping the inflationary spiral, which kept going up every month. An adult is now in the room. And so, let's go to the next one. From his first day, Peres shows that he's serious. How? Under Prime Minister Peres, Israel implemented a 9% devaluation of the shekel. You know what that means, right? You almost cut the value of the shekel from by 10% almost, which therefore means the money you're buying the money's not that you have in the bank is not as good as it was before. It's worth less, which incidentally helps the exports, if you know how that works. And Peres announced his intention to carry out a huge cut in the national budget. So basically he said, guys, get ready. As we would say today in America, they're going to cut the Social Security, they're going to cut the Medicare, they're going to cut the this, they're going to cut that. Get ready. Within 10 days of taking office, the cabinet imposed new taxes on luxury goods and business assets. So you buy a TV, no problem. Pay us $5,000 as a tax before you touch the TV. Who said, well, I'm not going to do it. Okay, then don't spend the money. You see? And while the finance minister, Modai, announced his intention to slash subsidies for basic food and fuel. Now, this is tough. If I don't get money for a subsidy for the fuel, I can only... many of us have been in Israel. It's cold in the winter, right? So it's okay, but this year you're going to put on a sweater. But my mother's in the house and she's 85. She'll put on 2 sweaters. It's a national emergency. That's what he said. Okay? A 6-month ban on 50 luxury imports followed a few days later. So they're restoring the old Mapai system in which you simply can't spend the money the way you want and you can't import and buy things the way you did until now. Once he showed he's serious, then, realizing that American financial help is vital, Shimon Peres flies to Washington to convince the Reagan administration that this time Israel is serious. Of course, Menachem Begin used to say, oh, we're working on it, we're going to get into inflation, but it was clear that he either was lying or was just out of his depth. Shimon Peres said, no, this time, as I said before, there's a responsible adult in the room. Now, to tell you the truth, Shimon Peres was at his best in this because he was a very good high-level diplomat, and especially with the American government, they always liked him. He knew how to press the right buttons and say the right things. That's who Peres was. And this was his strength. He'd been doing this since Ben-Gurion time and Kennedy. The Reagan administration, which was pro-Israel, was delighted that Peres was now prime minister, like I say, an adult, and not Begin or Shamir or Sharon, who they couldn't stand. This was always the problem in the first Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan was pro-Israel, but Menachem Begin drove him crazy. I hate to say it, but it's a fact. You understand? Ariel Sharon really drove him crazy. And in spite of driving him crazy, the Reagan administration tilted towards Israel. But now, they were delighted. None of those guys. Peres is normal. He's sane. He wants to work with us. And so when Peres comes as prime minister to visit Ronald Reagan, it's a love fest. And here you see their joint interview, or a little piece of it. You'll get the idea of what I'm talking about, because Reagan will refer to the fact that Peres is now undertaking to do something responsible about the economy in Israel, even though it's going to be painful. Take a look at this.
Terrorism is the cynical, remorseless enemy of peace, and it strikes most viciously whenever real progress seems possible. We need no further proof of this than the events of the last few weeks. The Prime Minister and I share a determination to see that terrorists are denied sanctuary and are justly punished. Furthermore, and just as important, Prime Minister Peres and I agree that terrorism must not blunt our efforts to achieve peace in the Middle East. Prime Minister Peres and I also have reviewed many other issues on our common agenda. We took stock with real satisfaction of what Israel and the United States have accomplished together. Among other things, we've concluded a free trade area agreement, the first of its kind for us, In this regard, I salute Prime Minister Perez and his government for their courage in adopting an economic reform program that holds promise if effectively implemented for leading Israel to strong and steady non-inflationary growth. We agreed last year that growth is the main objective, and we will continue to explore in our joint economic group and elsewhere ways to promote Israel's strong economic potential. Mr. Prime Minister, I thank you very much for your visit. It's been an occasion to renew a friendship and to review and enhance the strength of our unique bilateral relationship.
Mr. President, I'm grateful for the opportunity of expressing to you the admiration and the gratitude of the people of Israel. In our country, pluralistic as it is, where the national consensus is reserved for very rare occasions, you have achieved it, an admiration of all parts in our country, all people who came really to learn, to know you, and to admire you. We admire your leadership because it gave American greatness a new dimension, because it has introduced a new solidarity to the free world, because it has enhanced the desire for knowledge in the realm of science, because it has demonstrated a moving friendship for the new and old Israel. On personal note, may I add that one who has had to take decisions affecting the lives of young soldiers, I appreciate both your correct instinct and decisive reaction to the unfolding drama in the East Mediterranean last week, as it was manifested a real leadership and real courage.
You see what I mean? Malcolm Begin didn't talk that way. Peres does it lay it on thick, but in an elegant way. And Americans love that kind of talk. Now, in Washington, D.C., Shimon Peres encountered, therefore, a positive perfect storm in the team of Ronald Reagan and George Shultz, President of the United States and the Secretary of State. Reagan was, as I've argued before, fundamentally sympathetic in a general way. Ronald Reagan was one of the most pro-Israel presidents. But George Shultz, the Secretary of State, was remarkable. He was, first of all, brilliantly accomplished. He held all kinds of positions. And at the time, Secretary of State was head of the International, the Bechtel, one of the big multilaterals. He was a leading economist, which is unique among the Secretaries of State. I can't think offhand of any Secretary of State who had a background in economics. Isn't that interesting? Most of our Secretaries of State have been lawyers. That's just going back to Thomas Jefferson, the first Secretary of State. Most of them have been lawyers. A couple of them have been diplomats. That's just an interesting, fact. Kissinger was unusually at a PhD in international relations, in poli-sci. George Shultz was an economist. And therefore, when he became Secretary of State, he brought a basic knowledge of economics and fundamentals that you don't find ever in leaders of American foreign policy. And finally, he was the most pro-Israel Secretary of State in American history, except for Pompeo now. Well, let's take a look at it. There's Shultz with Reagan on the upper left-hand side, and with Shimon Peres. And here he is today. He's 100 years old. Right? Still around, he's still got his mind. George Peres Shultz. And not Jewish. And he was a great Secretary of State, although I don't think most people other than specialists are aware of this. And a great friend of Israel. Shultz had been Secretary of Treasury under Nixon. He had been Secretary of Labor under Nixon. He had been head of the Office of Management and Budget, OMB, under Nixon. These are chashuv important economic posts at the top of the American government. You understand? So the guy knew his stuff. He was a PhD, he went to Princeton and got a PhD in MIT in economics. He was a professor of economics at the University of Chicago. The guy who taught in the next room with Milton Friedman. He's coming out of a brainiac economist situation. Now, I remember personally that the Jews were scared to death, including myself, when Reagan announced that he was going to be the Secretary of State replacing Alexander Haig. Haig was a big friend of Israel, and when Haig was forced to resign in '83, they said to Schultz, that's oy vey. Schultz had went in bed with the Saudi Arabians. He's the head of the Bechtel Corporation, which had major construction projects in Saudi Arabia, and Israel's in big trouble. Well, the Jews were wrong. And I tell you the truth, I happen to remember, watching the news or something like that at that time. I remember there was a thing called the news, and, the 6:30. And I remember at the confirmation hearings, Schultz said something like, I bet you all are wondering if a guy like me can be a friend of Israel, and the answer is yes. Now, this is of extreme importance for our story tonight, because Shimon Peres was a serial coordinator with the U.S. administration, which is not a bad thing. So he got together with Schultz, and he explains his plans. They're not his plans. Shimon Peres is not an economist, but the plans of his economists back in Israel to tackle the economic nightmare. I mean, you know what to do. The question is how to implement it. George Schultz listens closely and offers sage advice and modifications. Meaning, he wasn't just blowing off steam. You're talking to a world-level economist. So when Peres said we should do this and this with the austerity, Schultz said, no, it's better to do it this way. Okay. And we should do this with the fiscal policy. And then Schultz like this, actually, it'd be better if you do it this and this way. So notice they were zachlik of things. He was giving them good advice. And it made sense, so Peres said, I commit to them. Okay? Then George Schultz said like this, if you truly carry out this program, which I can tell you is very difficult in a democracy. Schultz was in the Ronald Reagan administration. Ronald Reagan came in, the inflation was like close to 20%. Reagan and Paul Volcker put in this austerity business with the tightening the money supply and made a Reagan recession, if you recall. The first administration was a recession because they tightened up the money and people lost jobs and it was all hell broke loose. And the Republicans lost votes in the 1982 congressional elections, but Reagan hung tough. And then, of course, after the recession came the boom, okay, the Reagan prosperity. And so Schultz said, I know how hard it is to get things done in democracy. If you carry it and if you don't cheat, then we, the Americans, will help you. In case, as a result of your policies, Israel's reserves of money run low. Now, this was huge. Basically saying, we'll make sure you don't go bankrupt, provided you do the right thing and impose austerity. And Schultz said, I'm making Israel a personal interest of mine. Now, there's 100 and some countries out there. Secretary of State of the United States does not, ask every day, what's Tutsuk in Ceylon, and what's happening with the economy of Thailand, and all that kind of stuff. So he said, Israel, I'm interested in, and I'm appointing a team of American economists that I trust, and they'll be like your monitors. They'll follow you closely and report to me on your progress. And they'll keep me fully informed. I want two objective economists to tell me what's really happening. First one was Herbert Stein, right? He's a Jew. Herbert Stein was the head of, remember Ben Stein's father. Herbert Stein was the head of Nixon's Council of Economic Advisors. A famous economist once upon a time. There's him with Schultz and Nixon back in the, in the Nixon administration. Let me tell you something. Ben Stein was an assimilated Jew. And, but his wife is Jewish. And in 1972, he was Nixon's economic advisor. In 1972, they had Israel Independence Day. And Nixon said, I guess, I can't go. I'm sending Ben Stein to represent me. It's like a free trip. And Ben Stein came with his wife to Israel, and they never were there. And Golda Meir took him for dinner in her house. She cooked him dinner. And she said, let me explain Israel. She gave him the Golda Meir treatment. You understand? And here we are in Israel today, Holocaust, all the rest of it. And by the time the meal was over, the guy said they were crying their heads off, the husband and wife. So she converted them, as I would say, to Zionism. And now 12 years later, he's been called on to use his brains as a chairman, a leading economist, and watch that Israel, because what they're doing. And the other guy, was Stanley Fisher. Maybe you've heard of him, right? But later on became the head of the Israeli economy. So these were appointed by George Schultz. And I said, these will be my experts, and they're going to make sure that you're going to carry out what you do, and they'll keep me informed. Okay? Now, Shimon Peres performed. Let's go to the next slide. Enhanced by the assurances that Peres obtained in Washington, the Israeli cabinet then adopted an emergency economic passage on October 23rd. Well, this is October 27th today, so it's almost, 36 years ago. Including a 3-month freeze on wages and prices. You know what that means, right? No raises, and prices can't go up. And called for sharp cuts in the public sector jobs. So people are going to be fired because we have to cut the budgets for the different government ministries. With that breathing spell achieved, Yitzhak Modai, the Secretary of the Treasury, wanted to slash wages and profits by administrative decree and then push tight legislative constraints through the Knesset. But Shimon Peres, true to his personal proclivities and sensitive to the Labor Party's key support constituency, Peres was not the type of guy to say, we're just going to pass a law and everybody's going to do it that way. You got to persuade people. It's a democracy. Otherwise they'll cheat. You got to make it that they understand. And so Peres, you're worried about the powerful labor, he opted for voluntary cooperation. All right, you know what that means. In other words, if you cheat, there's no legal penalties. He gathered Israel's government and labor and business leaders in prolonged negotiating sessions to hammer out a broad package deal to replace the temporary program before it expired. To overcome sharp personality clashes with the brilliant but volatile Yitzhak Modai, Peres himself devoted endless days and nights to cajoling, lobbying, and wearing down the disputing interests. Okay? Is that it? Is there another one? No, that's not before. Let's go back. So, this is impressive. Because what it means is like this. You have to go, you portray a cup. First I got to meet with the unions. Then I got to meet with the other unions. Then I got to meet with the bankers. Then I got to meet with the other ones. And you know how it goes. You say, well, you're giving him, you got to meet me. The president, listen, we got to lower the inflation. So you got to do this one got to, no, it's not going to do it. Well, let me tell you why. Already, I got to sit there and hear you fumble away for 45 minutes. And then it's like this, listen, but we got to do it. We're going bankrupt. We got to do it. What is your solution? Make the other guy pay. Let's get real. In other words, it's like a show meeting. You understand? Went on and on and on, but he says, I'm going to do whatever is necessary so that at the end of the day, everybody's exhausted and they agree that what we got to do is what we got to do. So Peres displayed what we call in the yeshiva world, Sitzfleisch. Okay? Endless cajoling. Not forcing, but never stop cajoling. It's very impressive. Okay? It's the only way to work in a democracy. You got to get the people to see it. Now, most politicians don't have the patience. Menachem Begin ain't sitting for 20-hour marathon sessions. His health couldn't hold out. But Peres could. And he did. And like I say, one day he met the kibbutzim, another day he met the military, another day he met the industrialists, another day he met the dock workers, another day he met the government workers. It's impressive. Agreement was finally reached in late January of 85 on a broad package to last for 8 months, which included, notice everybody agreed, extended price and wage controls, an elimination of most subsidies, 10% cut in the government budget, harsh credit restraints, in other words, the price of borrowing goes up, the interest rates, and de facto weakening of the wage price linkage. So basically what that means is if the prices go up 10%, I'm only going to increase the wages 5%. So you're going to end up losing a lot. Okay? Because we can't afford to match it 10%. We just can't afford it. The government can't pay the workers double because the money, inflation double. We can't do it. Now, this is all huge. I hope you're following me because these are not little things. These are big. Other measures to stem the outflow of foreign currency were enacted by the cabinet. So you can't, in other words, like it used to be before Begin, you can't spend the money when you want to spend the money. You can't take money out of the country without a license and all that kind of stuff. So I'm going to force you to stop buying, like the mother who cuts the credit cards. You don't buy anymore, I buy, and you're not going to get the shiny, present you want for Hanukkah. You get a lesser for a present. And the kids said, wah. And the parents said, I guess there's a responsible adult in the room, and this young man is what we can afford. Now, this is a policy of causing pain to the individual Israeli citizen, but the bitter medicine was necessary. Peres endlessly explains to the Israeli public that these measures are unavoidable, even though it pains me, he says, to do them. I'm not happy to do this, but we got to do it. You understand? We're not proud of this. This is something we have to get through, but it has to be done. Okay? Now, Peres used his leadership skills to parlay the crisis into a national consensus by persuasion, as I just showed you, rather than compulsion. But as a result, the program was not as drastic as economic experts in Jerusalem and Washington had urged. Although as a political achievement, it's stunning. So they said, you got to cut even more, you have to do more. And Peres like, listen, it's hard enough to get this in. And they said, we realize, in economy, what you did is impressive, but really it's got to be more. And then it starts to unravel. Thanks to the reluctance of what we call in America the deep state to implement the budget cuts. Because he was breaking with norms. He said the factories are going to get less money and this, that, and the other, the old boy network. All I can tell you is unofficial price hikes and under-the-table salary increases were rampant throughout the economy, and inflation started rising rapidly again. So all that was for nothing. All over the country, workers were now striking for wage relief, and manufacturers were demanding price increases to compensate for the rising costs. Government budget cuts remained unrealized because, like I say, the deep state says we're going to spend the money anyway. And we all know, in this administration, other administrations, the bureaucrats of the deep state, that's a tough business to deal with. In addition, there were Histadrut elections. That's the national union that controls everything. In May of '85, and Peres didn't want to cut the subsidies too much, or the Likud guys would say, see, the labor doesn't care about the little guy and we do. And David Levy and the Likud would win the Histadrut elections, and he didn't want that. But if you don't have this radical cuts, then the inflation is going to return and Israel is going to go bankrupt. So Herbert Stein and Stanley Fischer come to Israel to be mechazik, the economists, to pressure Peres not to let the painful but necessary programs fall through. Listen, it's got to be done. The economists do so, and Peres says, all right, I hear what you're saying, and he holds marathon meetings with the cabinet and other power groups. And it gets to a point where Peres is like this, listen, I'm going to resign. If you don't give me the ability to do this, we're going to go bankrupt. I can't be in charge of this and watch all this happen. It can't happen. It's a time, you got to bite the bullet or I quit. It's a time for patriotism. We must save the nation. We must save the state of Israel. It's not a rhetoric on my part, it's a fact. And so, as a result, let's go to the next one. Peres was able to administer the castor oil. A whole program of 8 items, deep spending cuts, renewed wage price freeze, new taxes. First of all, that helps you pay your bills, and it takes money out of the public so they can't go and spend it improvidently. Public sector layoffs. He said, listen, we just got to fire people. I'm not happy about it. We got to fire people. Meaning we can't pay them wages. Elimination of subsidies that had crept back in the budget. Devaluation by 20% on top of the earlier devaluations. It's necessary, right? Because the money's not worth what we say it's worth. We got to be honest. Creating real wages by stopping linkage, which means, as I told you before, if the prices go up 20%, tough luck. You don't get a 20% raise anymore. We can't do it. And finally, as a result, you get a reduction in the real wages of 25%. So all across the board in Israel, the public took a hit of 1/4, 20%. You understand what I'm saying? Now, I want you to understand, in those days, the take-home pay in Israel was between $400 and $800 a month. A month. So imagine somebody's take-home pay is, even the high one, is what, $10,000 a year? A year? And now you're telling me, because of Shimon Peres, instead of me taking home $10,000 a year, I'm taking home, $7,500. That's a big, you're living hand to mouth on $10,000, aren't you? And how can you do it? He said, it's necessary. The public reacts with general strikes and demonstrations, but Peres holds firm. He says, Ein Breira, we have no choice. We have to do this. Now here's where Yitzhak Shamir came in. There was a natural partisan temptation on the Likud to sabotage the Peres measures and adopt the role that we're the champion of the little guy. But Yitzhak Shamir would not do so. He was a patriot, and he said like this, the guy's right. We're going to go bankrupt. They'll be bad for everybody. So I can't have this short-term politics, partisan business. And so as we see in the next slide, Shamir resists the partisanship, and he backs Peres and he does the right thing. So basically, this was Yitzhak Shamir's finest hour, right? Where he put patriotism above partisanship. As a reward, George Shultz gives Israel nearly $2 billion, which is a lot of money once upon a time, in financial aid to get through all this. It doesn't cover the whole thing, but it helps. This is classic George Shultz. I want to show you something in a second. The guy is, as I say, 100 years old, or will be very soon. He's 99. 2 years ago or 3 years ago, when he was 97, he had an interview, believe it or not. I mean, he still got his mind. Interview, a long interview. I found it online. And the guy who's interviewing him at the Hoover Institute and said like this: what's the right way for America to be a powerful country? And he says like this: we can only be a powerful country if we are able to help others. But we can only help others if they come up with the help themselves, and then we give them an extra push. We can't impose our ideas on them. They have to create the ideas, and if they're the right ideas, then we give them a little help. And that's how we have influence. You understand? And that's exactly what he did with Israel. He got them on their own, the economists in Israel, all those guys, to say, this is necessary if you want to avoid bankruptcy. This is necessary if you want to slash the inflation. This is necessary if you want to restore the economy. And as Ronald Reagan said before in that press conference, to start Israel in the process of start economic growth. And you're doing the right things. Oh, you're doing the right things, we can help you a little bit. Take a look at this. This is a 97-year-old guy.
And then we have to be able to reach out and help other countries. And you don't lead in the world by telling people what to do. You lead in the world by being helpful. Let me give an example. People refer often to the Marshall Plan. The Marshall Plan was not a U.S. plan to tell people how to reform their economies. The Marshall Plan said to Germany, France, Britain, and so forth, whose economies were in tough shape, think over carefully what you need to do to get your economy rolling, and then let's discuss it. And if you need some money to help push it along, we've got it. That's the Marshall Plan. But we were not pushing U.S. ideas. We were helping people develop their own ideas for how they think things should go.
That's exactly what happened. By the way, it's a chachma, you understand? It's a chachma. And so, in addition, George Shultz negotiates with Paris a free trade area pact with Israel, which never happened before, which meant you lower a whole bunch of tariffs. This means Israeli goods can enter the American market without paying the tariffs, and that means that Israel can export stuff to the United States. Shultz wants to help the Israeli exports enter the American market, although, of course, it's a two-way street. Now, American goods can enter the Israeli market, but that didn't happen, fortunately. One major cause of spending was the mess in Lebanon. The Israeli army was deployed all through the southern half of the whole country of Lebanon. The first thing Peres and Rabin did was withdraw the Israeli army to the southern strip of Lebanon, close to the Israeli border. Take a look at this map. On the left-hand side, right, you see, if you look closely, that the Israeli army, those arrows, penetrated all the way up to the parallel with Beirut, the entire southern part of the country of Lebanon, which means it was a Vietnam. Israel found itself fighting the Palestinians, the Shiites, the Sunnis, the Druze, this one, that one, and the other one, all this other kind of junk. And in all those cases, what can I tell you? The IDF was getting creamed. We're losing guys every day, and it's no longer a matter of the Israeli national defense. And second of all, it costs a fortune. So every day the Israeli army, the poor guys, were in that half of Lebanon. They're losing people, body bags come back. But it costs the Israeli taxpayer, I don't know, millions. Israel can't afford that. Very few countries can afford that, if any. And so, as you see, Shimon Peres and Yitzhak Rabin, who was the defense minister, they said, first thing we have to do is move the Israeli army all the way down, not back to Israel, but as you see on the right-hand side, up to the Litani River. I can't show you because of the nature of this presentation. If I were in Shomer, I would point to it. But just take it from me that the Israeli army withdraws from the vast majority of the part of Lebanon you see there to a small part just north of the Israeli border, to the left of the Golan Heights and the Galilee. And this became what they call the southern Lebanese border. And this is where the Israeli army was stationed for the next 15 years. Now, it wasn't perfect, and they had trouble there, and that's how Hezbollah started. It's a mess, and we'll talk about that. But you save a fortune of money because instead of occupying the whole eastern seaboard of the United States, now all you're holding on to is South Florida, so to speak. You understand? They reduced vastly the amount of territory that Israel had to hold on to, and that itself showed two things. Israel's not interested in annexing any Arab land, and number two, Israel's saving a lot of money by reducing the area of its military presence. So that was a sign Israel's serious about cutting expenses. The situation in South Lebanon is far from good. As I say, I'll discuss it, but it was better and cheaper the way they did it now, and it wins a lot of creds from the Reagan administration. And I would say in general, Shimon Peres strengthened the U.S.-Israel ties in a very dramatic way. This is going to sound funny what I'm about to say, but I don't mean to sound funny. It was providential, in my opinion. That's all you ever get here is my opinion. It's providential that the Pollard affair, Jonathan Pollard, happened when Shimon Peres was the prime minister and Reagan was the president. That was when Israeli-American relations was at their strongest. And even though it was a sharp blow, it was stout enough in its fabric to withstand the pressure. Had this happened, I don't know, when another president was there, or, when Jim Baker was there, who knows what, Shamir, it would have been bad news for Israel. That was bad news anyway, but it was less bad news this way. Now, in addition, in the good news column, fortunately for Peres, Israel benefited now from two international economic megatrends. And so, for a change, instead of suffering heavy blows, Israel now got a gust of wind in their sails. First of all, and this is a Cold War story, thanks to CIA Director Bill Casey, oil prices plummeted during the Reagan years. Do you know that? Now, let me say this. Why? This was part of Ronald Reagan's sneaky Cold Warism against the Soviet Union, which he pursued relentlessly, even away from the public eye. Russia is, quote-unquote, Soviet Union, a poor country. No good exports. Raise your hand if you want to import a Russian car. Raise your hand if you want to get a Russian TV. You see what I'm saying? Russian washing machine. It's not what you want. So, what can Russia export? The only thing they had was oil. They used to have Baku, which is now Azerbaijan, but that was part of the USSR. And Baku was like endless oil. And Russia made a lot of money on the international oil market. And when the price of oil shot up 20%, 20 times, not 20%, 2,000%, then Russia benefited economically. Ronald Reagan didn't like this. He wanted to bust the Russian economy if he could. And so the head of the CIA went to Saudi Arabia. This was Bill Casey. Now, at this time, I would remind you that the Russians were in Afghanistan. The Soviets were invading Afghanistan. So they tried to crush a Muslim country. So Saudi Arabia hates them. And he said like this, let's kick the Russians in the pocketbook. If you, the Saudi Arabians, will dramatically increase your production of oil, what will that do to the international price? You understand that, right? Supply and demand. If there's going to be a whole lot more oil out there in the market, the price will plummet. And this will kick the Russians where it counts. And that's what happened. So during the Reagan years, the price of oil in the international market plunged. And it was nowhere near as expensive as it had been in the 70s. Much, much, much less. The guys they were really at was not to benefit the American car drivers, but to kick the Russians in the teeth. But who benefited from this among others? The state of Israel. Because the state of Israel has to buy all of its oil. And if the price is dramatically reduced, then Israel is a collateral beneficiary of the Reagan Cold War sneaky policies. That's what I mean. And take a look at the next slide and you see what I'm talking about. It's a Cold War chad gadol. Because in other words, Reagan and the Soviets to Reagan and the Saudis to the Soviets to the international economy to Israel. Right? They depressed the price of oil, which benefits Israel. Secondly, the other good thing that happened to Israel was that there was a Reagan boom following the Reagan recession. I told you, when Reagan came in, the interest rate was 20%, the unemployment was high, the stagflation as they used to call it over here, all the economic indicators are bad. Reagan did it the old-fashioned hard way, which is you reduce the money supply. The Federal Reserve did it. And naturally, business went bust. Credit went crazy. A lot of people lost their jobs. But it was unfortunately necessary from the classic economic point of view to restore efficiency in the economy. And then, once that happened, then they started all over again and business started to revive. And therefore, after 83, 84, let's say, started the Reagan boom, which spread around the world. In the 80s, the mid-80s, the years I'm talking about, was a time of good international economics. So what does that mean if good times are spreading everywhere? International interest rates fell dramatically. the price of borrowing money in the international markets fell dramatically as a result of the economic boom, and Israel found it cheaper to borrow money, and that helped a lot also. So these macro international trends could either hit Israel or benefit Israel. It's basically you're rowing a little boat with a sail, and if a good wind comes, matov v'anoim. If a bad wind comes, you can get capsized. What can you do? That's what a little country. Israel is a small country. That's the world in which we live. And so the bottom line of all this tonight is that Shimon Peres pulled off a miracle in relative terms. Let's go to the next one. Just take a look at these numbers for a second. What was the inflation in the 60s under Ben-Gurion and Eshkol? 9%. But then under Golda Meir, it shot up to 13%. But under Begin, it went to 110%, and by the time Begin was finished, 450% inflation a year. Then under Peres, he cut it dramatically from 450 to 185%. Now you tell me like this, what kind of Michigas is a country 185%? Yeah, compared to 450, it's very impressive. That's what I mean, in relative terms. I'm not finished. Go to the next year, and look what happened. It went from 185% to 19% to 20%. Now again, in America, 20% would be catastrophic. In Israel, 20% was, compared to what had been a few years before, gewaldic. Okay? And in 1999, after Bibi came in, it went down to 1%. Okay? So, inflation, and Bibi's been anti-inflation. Inflation is a very important factor in helping or ruining an economy, and Israel has had a funny history with this. What I described were the worst years. And what I'm describing tonight is when Israel turned the corner, although they didn't get total liberation. Very few democratic countries have been able to pull off elimination of inflation, as you see it in the next slide with Reagan and Volcker. That's unusual. And Reagan took a lot of heat for this, a lot of heat. The case of Israel has been extensively studied in economics departments around the world ever since, because you can't think of another country which has a democratic institution, not a dictatorship, democratic institutions in which they were voluntarily able to reduce in a very short time. I just showed you the chart. In 2 years, they went from 450 to 19%. You can't deny that. That's impressive, and Shimon Peres did it. Now, why did it stay for 19%? Why is it 20%? It stayed 20% for many, many years. That's still high. Well, once inflation was dramatically reduced, Peres restored a certain amount of indexing. You know, he had too much political pressure to have the people hurting from not being able, to keep up with the, the inflation and the economic wreckage, and so he started indexing. Once you index, you say, if the thing went up 2%, I'm going to give the workers 2%. If it went up 10%, I'm going to 10%. That itself increases the inflation. So, in a democracy, it's not all about economics. It's about people to some degree. It's a very, very difficult balance to maintain, extremely difficult. And he said, I got to put in some indexing to help the what is it called, the proletariat, the workers, to prevent them from drowning, because then we'll have a revolution. Okay? And more importantly, I would say, in my opinion, Shimon Peres remained at heart a Ben-Gurion statist at heart, and he couldn't ruthlessly privatize. He's from the old Israel, in which the government should own the factories, the kibbutzim should get special treatment, all these inefficient industries and enterprises should be helped because they're good for the national interest. And Peres and his guys, his party, labored to retain as much of the old economy as they could, instead of letting the Histadrut enterprises go under if they were bloated and inefficient. That's what we call the discipline of the marketplace. If you're not making the money, you're gone. Peres labored to have them reform internally and become more lean and mean. So he would basically say this company is losing a lot of money. I'm going to bring in a management team. I'm not saying to fire anybody. But let's do this, let's do this, let's do this, and eliminate some of the more efficient things. If necessary, we'll fire a few people. And better yet, how about, instead of firing people, can we figure out a way to produce more so that way you'll be less in the red and more in the black? Well, and theoretically it's good. It doesn't really work. From a purely economic perspective, this perpetuated efficiency, which requires government subsidies, which wasted money and skewed the economy. Worst of all, it contributed to low productivity, and that means Israel was not making money by selling stuff overseas, which is what the country needed if it's going to meet its ends. So, on the other hand, as I said before, you can't simply tell the employees lose their employment, and have 1 million people, starving in the streets. As they say in America, these companies and enterprises were too big to fail. Remember that term under Obama? It's too big to fail. Because if the car companies in Detroit under Obama would have really gone down the tubes, it would have had, they said, a catastrophic effect on the whole American economy, and someone would depend on this, and therefore the government had to bail them out. That's what we did in this country as well. Now, let's go to the next one. In classic American 19th century economics, let the whole country go through a depression. That was Grover Cleveland, you understand? He said the government should be run as a trust and as a business on business principles. And economy, if Detroit goes down the tubes and 50 million people go broke and another 100 people, starve, as they gate us. And then after a year or two, it'll turn around and we'll have boom and bust again. You can't do that nowadays. You just can't do it. And so bloated companies and low productivity would continue, and my friends still do continue in Israel. In addition, as I'm a pie guy, Paris continued to subsidize the kibbutzim, Shavuot, the other agricultural stuff. In other words, the price you pay when you go to the store and buy Israeli pickles or tomatoes does not really reflect the actual cost. It's less than it should cost. You get what I'm saying? If you go, now it's a Corona, but if you go to some mall or something like that, and you buy a place, like I said, with the Israeli olives, it costs, I'm just making this up, costs $1. Really, it costs $1.50. But in order to help them sell you, the government gives them 50 cents, and that way they can sell it 50. Not good. Okay? As a statist, Paris would argue, with a certain justification, Israel needs its own agriculture. We can't be dependent on others for food. Israel needs El Al. We need for national security, for Mossad purposes. It's all true. Okay? It's not push it. And as a result, the amazing suppression of inflation is not accompanied by a restructuring of the Israeli economy along neoliberal lines. This is the 1980s. Let's go to the next one. There are the three iconic figures of the neoliberal economy of the 80s. The three capitalists, as we said before, Ronald Reagan, Margaret Thatcher, and Helmut Kohl of Germany, whose economies did amazingly under neoliberal principles, as we would say anti-socialist principles. Israel was not part of that, not under Paris. The old Ben-Gurion economy would continue, because that's who Shimon Peres was, and that, my friends, is the answer to the question why you still had 20% inflation. The restructuring of the Israeli economy along modern lines would not happen under the labor governments in Israel, nor under the Shamir-led Likud governments, because Shamir, too, even though it was in Likud, was a statist. This is the state of mind of these people from that generation. Restructuring would await, as we see in the next slide, the coming of a new face in Israel, and that would be Bibi, who is a graduate of MIT, right? At least an education in economics. The new economy is amazing in Israel. Let's go to the next one. You then look at these figures. What has been the inflation since Bibi took over in 2010? Look at these numbers from the bottom up. In 2010, the inflation was not 19%, but less than 3. In 2011, it was between 3 and 4. In 2012, when the full effect of the BB policies, and what's that guy, Stanley Fischer, came in with handling the money situation right, the fiscal situation right, putting all your eggs in the startup nation and all that kind of business. What's the inflation in 2012? Less than 2%. 2013, less than 2%. 2014 and afterwards, look at that. 2014 till today, less than 1%. That's amazing. That's amazing. A country that in the 80s had 1,000%, today, less than 1%. No, there's basically no inflation. Now, some debate this, depending if you're a Keynesian, or different economists, they say, you need a little bit of inflation. Countries that have been burned by inflation don't want them. Germany had that bad inflation in the 1920s, and they don't want it. You understand? Because of that, Germany's always had a prosperous economy. Israel had bad experience in the Begin years with this runaway inflation. They don't want it. And Bibi represents the capitalist face of Israel, with the good and the bad of the capitalism. The corruption, the fact that a few families own the whole economy, all that business, income inequality, no question about it. But one thing, the face of the capitalist economy is, if I have $1 million in the bank or 1 million shekels, I want the 1 million shekels to be worth 1 million shekels next year too. And so I do not want inflation. Okay? And that means a foreign government or foreign investor says, maybe I'll invest in Israel because the money's still good. It's sound. Look at those numbers. No inflation. It's pretty incredible. Let's go to the next map. as you see, the economic statistics, which usually people, fall asleep, they're actually kind of interesting if you know how to look. Again, these are the BB years. He came in 2009, first year of Obama. He's been there ever since. Look, for example, not at 1, 2, 3. Look in the middle, the GDP growth real, the actual growth of the economy, which is what you need. Those are impressive numbers. What's his name? Donald Trump was trying to get to 3 and 4%, and he got to 2.5 or something like that, which was also good. The Trump economy was doing well before the corona hit. Okay, but Trump would die to get 3% in 2009, and then 2%, 3.5, 1.7, 1.5, and then in 2014 it was not much growth at all. I'm sorry, I got the wrong column. I'm very wrong. I should be looking at GDP. So it was 1.3. Then in 2010, 5.5%. That's amazing. I don't know if you understand these things, but you've heard of 10% growth. 5% is amazing. In 2011, 5%. In 2012, 2%, then 4%, then almost 4%, then 2.5%, 4%, 3.5, 3.5. These are good numbers. You understand? It's not 5%. These are good numbers. America would love to get these kind of numbers. Then we'd see a lot of the unemployment get shrunk up. You'd see dramatic growth and all these kind of things. So all I can tell you is that Israel's kind of learned the lesson in some ways and not in the others, because we have the downsides of the capitalist economy and we have the problem with the productivity. Anyway, I think I've spoken enough for tonight. That's all for the future. I've gone long enough, and with that I bid you a good night and a good vach.